and the state was not able to contribute all of the money to repair those. But through a partnership with the city, we're taking pieces of it, and we're able to accomplish some of the goal that we need to accomplish. Now, with regard to the seawall, that's a much different situation, because it really isn't something that can be done in a completely piecemeal fashion. We have to do it pretty much as one project if we're going to have success. The difficulty is that the entire coastline is facing problems with seawalls. And one of the issues that we face is just trying to prioritize how we're going to address all of those things with the scarce resources that we have. And even more specifically, one of the issues that we face is when we try to work with the city, we try to prioritize what we're going to seek on behalf of Gloucester. And there are a number of seawalls that Gloucester needs fixed, and what we don't want to do is wind up competing with ourselves. So we work with Jim and with Mike, and we try to get together our list so that we can figure out what exactly we're going to pursue, let's say in a 1 to 2, maybe even a 5-year time frame, because it's clear that Gloucester has more need than just for this particular seawall. So that's the first thing that we have to try to approach. The second thing we try to approach is, what are the dollars that might be available? And I think Jim has mentioned that we're starting to see the expense or the depletion of Seaport bond funds. Now, there's good news in that and there's bad news in that. And I know you'll say, well, how can I find good news in that statement? Well, the good news is because the bill is starting to tail out in terms of its useful life, it's very likely that we're going to have to file a new one and pass a new one. And as that process unfolds, the likelihood is that we would try to put in specific appropriations for seawalls. I don't know that there was one in the current bill, and I was involved with putting that one together many years ago before Ann Margaret arrived on the scene. So we can look at whether or not we can create more resources on a going forward basis for seawalls. The second thing that's important is that for the first time in a long time, we recently enacted legislation that specifically makes dollars available for seawalls outside of the Seaport process. The Seaport bond bill was largely intended to revitalize the working ports of Massachusetts, and it has functionally accomplished a lot of that purpose. But the fact of the matter is we've tried to stretch it in different directions and help as many communities as we could outside of the 5 or 6 major ports in Massachusetts. But it was clear to us that we needed to have a specific program just for seawalls. So there was a piece of legislation that was filed that had to do with the removal and the repair of dams, which are actually another very large problem in Massachusetts. And in fact, what you have with dams is a number of them that are abandoned. So they're privately owned. The private owner doesn't want anything to do with the liability for the dam, so they abandon that piece of property. And so that's a huge problem. So one of our colleagues had filed a bill that had to do with dams. We had filed a bill that had to do with seawalls. So we actually amended the dam bill to add seawalls. And we were able to find an unused source of state money that had to do with the state revolving fund, and we're able to put into that fund about $17 million. And the language of the bill reads, and I brought copies for everyone, that's what this is. The language of the bill specifies that not less than half can be used for dams, which means the other half can be used for seawalls. So that gets us about $8.5 million. Now that sounds great until you begin to look at the enormous need. And I'll give you an example. I mean, our neighbor, to the north in Rockport, has got one seawall at Long Beach that is likely to cost $12 million to repair. So $8.5 million in absolute terms sounds like a lot of money, but when you put it into context, it's not a lot of money at all. Now the guidance is just coming out for that in terms of how we're going to apply for it, and actually Jim and the mayor have been on top of that, and they've been very aggressive with working with us to try to get some of that money for Gloucester, and it's our intent that some of that money will come to Gloucester. But now the difficulty is, which project does it fund? And you also face the situation of, do you try to get some money for each of several projects, or do you try to get a larger sum and complete one project? That's the kind of decision making that we're likely to be in. In addition to that, there may be the possibility, and we need to talk about this because we haven't before tonight, because of the most recent disaster declaration or emergency declaration for the blizzard, that if we can plausibly claim that the wall was injured in substantial way by the blizzard, we may be able to pursue some of those dollars. Will it be $2 million? Probably not, but anything that we could get would help. And I think Frank envisions that partnership. If the city's gonna step up to the plate, even if we can't come to the table with all of those dollars, anything we can do to help defray that cost, I think would be welcome, and we'll work to do that. So I did bring a little bit of information about the bill that just got passed into law for dams and seawalls. I brought some information relative to the Seaport Council, what it is and what it does, because it's largely misunderstood. And I would point out that the mayor does have a vote and a seat on that council, and that's very important. In addition to that, I also brought some information about a couple of other bills that are pending relative to seawalls. And I know that the need is more immediate than to talk about legislation that's pending and might happen, but I thought it would be good to put it into context of what we're faced with as a state. This is an enormous, enormous unmet need. And we have yet begun to identify all of the dollars that it's going to take to be able to complete these projects. Now, for some of them, we're able to get federal dollars as well from the Army Corps of Engineers. And again, we could talk about that, but the Army Corps' principal focus right now are things that they actually own. So, for instance, you see the jetties being repaired at the mouth of the Merrimack River. Those are owned by the Army Corps of Engineers. So there's a corresponding responsibility to repair them. Or projects that have to do with navigability that particularly relates to commercial shipping and traffic. And right now, that's a very hard standard to meet because we're competing with large ports all across the country, and we're still competing with the reconstruction of basically the port of New Orleans. And so when we talk about those, it's more remote, but it's certainly something that we can do in terms of pursuing it. And one of the things that we can bring to the table is to bring some folks out from the Army Corps of Engineers to have a conversation with us. Again, it may yield nothing. Like everyone else, we don't want to waste time, but it may make sense to have them out there to talk to us if for no other reason than they likely are going to have some permitting jurisdiction over the project. So it makes sense to have the conversation to at least see what we're up against from a permitting standpoint, and then see if we can find some dollars by shaking that tree. We can also, and Margaret and I have done this, bring the Commissioner of the Department of Conservation and Recreation out to Gloucester. We brought him to Rockport to look at their seawall, and they are the agency that has jurisdiction largely for the repair of such structures, and they might be able to offer us some engineering expertise to begin the design. They might be able to have some ideas about how to pursue some additional money. And we can bring folks out from MEMA, the Mass Emergency Management Agency, to look at the wall and see if there might be something that they can do by virtue of this most recent declaration. Everything I've just said is speculative, and I don't want to create a false expectation or a hope. But what I do want to do is create the expectation and deliver on that expectation that the legislative delegation will work with the city in every way that we can to try to make this project go, both from a regulatory standpoint in terms of getting permits, which can be not as easy as it should be, as well as a financial aspect, because we want to partner as we have on so many occasions. We have been able to get a lot of money from the Seaport Council for Gloucester and for capital projects. Again, we're starting to see the end of the life cycle of that bond bill, so it's unlikely we'd be able to tap this one, but we can think about the next one. And I speak with a fair degree of confidence that we will see another bill. It's just a question of timing. We've got a lot of bond bills that are going to be in the pipeline. The one that you've been reading about is the transportation bond bill, which is going to be coming shortly to follow on the heels of the transportation finance bill that we did. But somewhere in there will be a Seaport bond bill, and obviously we'll be watching that one very carefully.
Yeah.
So I see a hand go up, and I defer to...
Yeah, if I could just jump in before we take the
I'd just like to thank Ann Margaret for also coming out. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule.
No,
Margaret.
it's
Truly
my
appreciate
pleasure.
it.
It's my pleasure to be here, and I apologize for
Thank you.
being late, but the events of the day and everything have piled up.
Jump
but,
right in there, my friend.
But no, I just wanted to jump in, because the governor did file the new Seaport bond bill, and I think it's a $97 million bond bill, and just to put that into perspective, if you look at, just as the senator was talking about the Long Beach wall and the $16 million, and you think of what you saw during the blizzard on news stations, if you saw Situate, if you saw Revere, if you saw Plymouth, if you saw southeastern Mass,
Wow.
and all of a sudden you think of $97 million as compared to each one of these seawalls costing, in the tens of millions of dollars, it doesn't take long before you realize, even if all the money in the bond bill were dedicated to seawalls, that would only be about 9 seawalls statewide. So that just sort of puts into perspective how enormous this problem is. And as the senator was saying, it's an unmet need that we have to get our hands around. And I think personally, even bringing out the Army Corps of Engineers, as Senator suggested, even bringing out the commissioner, what that's gonna help us do is move this project to the point where it's being talked about and move up that list, because my fear is if all of a sudden there's 20 seawalls on a list and we're not being talked about and we don't have people out here looking at that, then we're gonna stay down in number 20th range. Whereas if we bring attention to it and we start talking about it, then hopefully we can bump it up to a higher priority, and something that, if we do our diligence, we put the package together and we show them we know what the cost is, what it would take to do it permitting wise, then hopefully that moves us up the ladder more quickly than if we weren't to have those people out. So I agree with what the senator said in terms of making sure we have everybody out here, they see it, they start cataloging it, they start assessing it, and then we put ourselves in line. So as the Seaport bond bill gets passed and is debated, as some of these other income sources or revenue sources come to pass, that we're right there and, as they say, shovel ready and ready to go, so we would be one of the first projects picked.
Shovel ready and ready to go, does that mean the engineering plan would be approved prior to it, Michael? Yeah?
That's where we are with
Long way to go.
Stacy's Boulevard.
Yeah.
Okay,
It's not that far.
So that acknowledges what Frank Wright just said,
right.
is that we should be prepared as a community with the proper information that we've started to gather, so that we can get a somewhat of a head start on that so-called list that you talked about.
Yeah.
I think, from what I hear, is it's a long way between us and the $2 or $3, $4 million is gonna have to take to rip that thing down and put it back up again. So I think we really ought to be prepared to do it ourselves somehow.
I think
don't know how that
it's
is.
important to also recognize, we've started a lot of this process. We have had DCR out, we have had MEMA out, we have had FEMA out even recently after the blizzard. Certainly Lanes Cove Seawall was one of the issues that we claimed from the blizzard of February. So we have started it. My level folks, maybe not the same, not the commissioner, but we've had the people that would certainly do the field reconnaissance.
Or if there's something that Senator Tarr said in terms of finding out if there is a particular designation of harbor of refuge and where that might come from, maybe Corps of Engineers, and if Lanesville meets that category, does that mean that there's some responsibility to maintain that or to repair it or to redesign it or whatever? Because my hopes for the future, I've heard that there are more boats working in the bay now, and it might be very important to have a safe harbor of refuge, and if there is a designation, like I'm saying, to prioritize the cove in that sense.
What's important to the Corps is commercial use, and so that helps to fit that category, particularly as we see more activity, and hopefully we're going to continue to see fishing activity in the bay, commercial fishing activity, and that's something right now that's very much in jeopardy, but that's a subject for another day. The difficulty is the Army Corps has the responsibility for lots of things that they don't repair right now. So it helps us to make our case, but the difficulty is that the metrics that they are using do not lend themselves to us getting dollars. For instance, the Annisquam River needs to be dredged. It's needed to be dredged for somewhere between 5 and 10 years, and maybe longer than that. They should have responsibility to do that, but because they would argue to us there isn't enough commercial traffic, then they've been unwilling to do it. Notwithstanding the fact that there's a safety issue, because the Coast Guard with a 47-foot motor lifeboat can't effectively respond at some tides. The fact that there are boats continuously getting stuck and running aground. You know, we have a whole series of problems, and navigability is at risk. But when you match that river with other commercial waterways, it doesn't meet the test right now. So yes, we need to continue to make the case to the Corps, and we know who to make that case to. And again, you know, we'll work with Mike to make sure that we try to push this up the chain. The difficulty is the competition is fierce and the dollars are very limited. And the other issue that's changed with regard to Washington is that it used to be that the budget would be earmarked federally to direct the Corps towards some of these projects that might not make it in terms of the metrics that they use to measure the importance of a project, but because politically it's important to someone, they've been able to move it up on the list. That practice isn't occurring in Washington right now. So it's much more of an internal process with the Army Corps of Engineers. Now, we have had success working with the congressman and with the federal legislative delegation, still trying to work internally, but it's not the way that it used to be, where someone has the ability to put an earmark in the federal budget and direct them to do something that doesn't meet the test, which we would argue is an unfair test. So the landscape has changed, we're learning how to navigate it, but this is a situation, as the representative said, we're trying to do everything we can to move things up the list a little bit. And the question is, are we able to get some of those dollars or all of those dollars in time to meet the need of this project before we see more deterioration? And we're sensitive to that.
Could I just to clarify, this, excuse me, this $12 million that's yet to be spent, more or less, and then there's another 90.
No, the entire bill itself, seaport, so that's covering everything that has to do with seaports.
But the point is, there's both money now and money hopefully in the future. Who makes the decision? The famous list we're talking about, who keeps that list? Is that somebody within the state government? Putting the feds to one side. Who do we go to if we want to make a case?
With regard to the seaport bond, there's actually almost two parallel processes that occur. The Seaport Council hears all of the requests and considers those requests and makes recommendations. Ultimately, the decisions, and this is an opinion, you won't read this anywhere, are made by the Secretariat of Administration and Finance, who's looking at how much money can be spent on all of these projects. So A&F will have a certain number that's coordinated with what the council thinks are priorities. The two come together and you get funding. The other thing is, the council doesn't always spend seaport bond money. Sometimes they spend environmental bond bill money too. So the two keepers of the list, if you will, are the Secretariat of Administration and Finance under the governor and the Seaport Council.
But can we get to A&F if we don't have Seaport Council backing?
That's a good question. I would suggest we operate on parallel tracks.
But the Seaport Council still represents an important step.
Very much so. And the Seaport Council also has another group that operates in a consultative role, which are known as the port professionals, who actually work to judge the viability of projects and the design of projects and whether they're suitable. And so we can start that conversation. But one thing that I don't want to get lost here is Gloucester is one of the ports that the Seaport Bond Bills target, because it's a working port, it's an important port in the Commonwealth, and we have to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what we ask the city to ask for from the Seaport Council. Because again, this isn't the only thing that the city needs, and we need to be clear that that list is something that, you know, we can all live with, and that we don't come in and say we want this, but the administration already has a list of 5 or 6 things that it's identified as priorities. That's got to be harmonized, because we don't want to compete with ourselves.
Now, are we going to get a little bit of a piece? I know that the Stacy Boulevard and everything is a big deal.
Right.
But can we expect some of the push that the city's going to lay on the Seaport Council to come to Lanesville? Can we get some kind of a, you know, you guys get 80%, we get 20%, whatever the deal is going to be?
Right.
We need to know whether we've got some backing from from your office.
We will absolutely advocate to the Seaport Advisory Council for the Lanesville seawall. Absolutely. As you accurately pointed out, Stacy Boulevard was at the forefront of the most recent funding request. But clearly, we will absolutely advocate for Lanesville.
So when you
In
go-
addition to, but don't forget, in addition to, we're gonna make sure that we're advocating for seawalls throughout the city also. It's not just we're just gonna pull Lanesville out. We wanna make sure that we,
But aren't we the crisis right now? Us and Stacy? Is there anybody else that's hurting the way we are?
I can't answer that question, Frank. Not that I won't, but I don't know, quite honestly.
Okay.
Mike?
Those are the two biggest ones. For me, it's Stacy's second to the canal itself. I think the canal is the most critical one, because the easterly side of the canal is in peril. I mean, that's gonna go in, that could close that channel. We have our 2 finished water mains that run under that, until we get across the river upstream later this year. That could have a major impact. I'll be white-headed if that wall goes instantly.
And I think it's important too, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Stacy Boulevard project is largely designed, right? So it's ready to go.
It is ready, again, I think we anticipated funding to be, anticipated the project to be funded some time ago. And actually, the Seaport actually funded some of the design.
Yeah.
Well, that's what, we wanna be. We wanna get the ball moving and not stop. Just keep it moving forward, and don't just sit and wait for something to happen. Let's move it forward.
We need to get to the point
Let's
of
hear from
the show already.
this person right here, if we could. You've had your hand up, so.
In light of keeping Lanes Cove near the top of the list, is there anything that residents of Lanesville can do in terms of writing letters to a particular person or agency that would keep them more focused on Lanes Cove?
I think there will be.
Letters?
Well, I think first of all, and Jim can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think first of all, and Jackie, just letters stating how important it is to the city council and to the administration, help give them the backup that they need to say there should be a priority on that list of things that comes forward. And then in addition to that, we will identify, once we've made contact with the folks that we want to talk to, we'll let you know, and it would be helpful if you wrote to them. But right now, we just as soon let us start the conversation and have you come in behind us so that we've set the stage for those letters to have leverage. Because if you just wrote in after tonight randomly, they might not know what we're talking about. But we'll put together a meeting with the folks that we need to talk to. We don't want to ignore the work that's already been done by the city in terms of some of those contacts. But what we'd be happy to do after we have a discussion is provide names and addresses to Councilor Hardy, who could then circulate it for everyone to write. So there will be a time, it's just not quite that time right now.
Is there a funding cycle?
That's an outstanding question. The Seaport Bond Bill does not use a cycle. It works on sort of a rolling basis, but it also has to fit within the state bond cap and the capital spending plan. And I'm trying not to use to make this too complicated, but a number of years ago, Massachusetts got into trouble because in the last recession, well, no, a few recessions ago now. Anyway, back in the late 80s, we started bonding everything, including operating expenses. And the consequences of that on the state budget were disastrous. So a number of years ago, there was a bipartisan agreement to set a bond cap that limits the amount of borrowing that state government can do every year. That necessarily means there has to be a plan on how to spend that money. That's called the capital spending plan. That's usually put together for the coming year, sometime in September or October. And it's divided by secretariat. So for instance, DCR will come in and say, we need this much, and the folks at Economic Development will say we need this much. And by category, they're granted amounts of money within that, and then they break it down as to what they want to spend those allocations on. So there isn't really a sort of a cycle where if you don't submit an application by this date, you miss it. The amount of money that's going to be spent for the coming year is usually set in the fall, and then we have to make our case within those caps. And by the way, that cap has been going up. It started out as $1 billion, and now it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.7 billion. I think it's approaching $2 billion. So there are constraints, but it isn't that someone's going to say, this is the deadline, you have to submit it. It's much more of an evolutionary process.
Okay.
Yes,
Back to the letter writing business. I appreciate that you want us to wait and that we start with Councilwoman Hardy and that kind of thing, but you were talking earlier about metrics and what the kind of metrics that the Army Corps of Engineers was looking for. It would be helpful, I think, as we write letters, for us to know what to put in the letters. And so if we could figure out some sort of communication system where, you know, I mean, I love it for all the things that I'm signed up for, where they at least tell me what to say to my representatives, and what points to make. Sometimes they even give me the letter, but.
We've noticed that.
need to meet the criteria.
But it would be helpful to have, you know, the things that I should stress in my letter, and so if we could figure out, you know, so it's one thing for, yeah, so anyway, if we could have that, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Well, again, it seems to me that the best way to be to work is a point of contact through Consular Hardy, but we can definitely give you points. I will tell you that as the folks that are on the receiving end of the photocopied letters,
Right. Yeah, I don't want those.
we'd rather just give you points because the much more compelling letters that we get and emails are the ones that are not generic.
I understand that,
So-
but I also want to speak to, whether
Yes.
I'm writing to
Yeah.
you or someone else, I want to say the things that are important
Yeah.
to whomever it is that's getting that letter.
Yeah, no, we'll have the bullet points.
Yeah.
Okay, right, okay. Yes, sir.
Tim Millis, 63 High Street. You mentioned that there are issues